In the winter of 1917, a letter posted in London on a Tuesday could be in a soldier's hand in a flooded trench outside Ypres by Thursday afternoon. That is faster than some parcels move across Britain today. No telegraph wire reached into that trench. No telephone line ran to the men holding it. There was no aircraft dropping supplies. No radio link back to a divisional headquarters that the average infantryman could ever use. The only thing connecting that soldier to his mother's kitchen table or his wife's fireside was a small government department that most people, then and now, barely think of as part of the war at all. The post office. By the last full year of the war, this operation was moving more than 12 million letters to the Western Front every single week. Add parcels, postcards, and official correspondence, and the true volume was larger still. It did this without motorways, without computers, without a single central warehouse holding everything in one place. It did it with handwriting, railway timetables, cross-channel steamers, canvas mailbags, and a workforce that had grown, in 4 years, from a few hundred men to several thousand. The question worth asking is not whether the system worked. The evidence is not really in dispute there. The question is how something built almost overnight, in August 1914, by an organization nobody associates with warfare, reached that scale, that speed, and that reliability. And why, when members of Parliament wanted to know who was actually responsible for it, the answer they received was not the War Office. It was the Postmaster General. The story begins with an unglamorous reserve unit that most soldiers never gave a second thought to, the Royal Engineers Postal Section. In peacetime, it barely existed as a distinct organization at all. It was a part-time reserve, a few hundred men who trained occasionally on weekends and otherwise worked ordinary jobs behind the counters and sorting frames of the General Post Office. When Britain mobilised in August 1914, this unit did not have to be recruited from nothing, trained from scratch, or built up over months. It already existed, fully formed, inside the ordinary civilian postal service. On the day war was declared, it simply put on a uniform and crossed the channel. Within days, advance parties were already at work in France. A base post office opened at Le Havre in a building on the Rue de Caligny. An advanced base post office followed soon after at Amiens, set up inside a public hall normally used for civic gatherings. Stationary post offices, handling the steady middle stage of the journey, were established at Rouen and at Boulogne. Mail addressed to individual soldiers first travelled to a dedicated military base office inside the General Post Office building in London, where clerks who had, until recently, been sorting ordinary domestic post, now sorted it by regiment and battalion before it ever left the country. This was not the army improvising a postal service in its spare time, the way a unit might improvise a field kitchen from whatever was to hand. This was the post office extending its existing machinery. Sorting frames, unit ledgers, trained clerks who already knew how to move paper quickly and accurately into an active war zone, port by port, depot by depot, almost exactly as it already operated at home. By early 1915, the post office's own engineers had reorganized the chain so that Boulogne, rather than Le Havre, handled the bulk of letter mail moving to the front. That single change in routing cut roughly a day and a half from the time it took a letter to reach the railheads that fed supplies and post onward to the divisions holding the line. Nobody remembers that decision today? It appears in no memoir, no newsreel, no soldier's diary. But every man who received a letter a day and a half sooner because of it benefited from a choice he never knew had been made on his behalf. None of this machinery was tested gently. Its first real trial arrived within months. At Christmas, 1914, and it is worth understanding exactly how severe that trial was. Letter volume rose by roughly 90% that December compared with an ordinary month. Parcels rose by something closer to 3.5 times their normal number, as families at home did what families have always done at Christmas. They sent socks, tobacco, tinned food, warm clothing, anything that might make a waterlogged trench slightly more bearable for a son, a husband, or a brother. The Royal Engineers Postal Section, barely 4 months into the war and still finding its footing, had to absorb that surge or fail its very first serious test in front of the entire army. It did not fail. Staff numbers were pushed up from around 900 men to 1,500 in a matter of weeks. Dozens of additional lorries were found for postal work alone, on top of the vehicles already assigned to carry ammunition and supplies to the front. The surge passed, the backlog cleared, and the system did not simply survive the strain. It absorbed it, adapted around it, and then kept growing to meet whatever came next. That surge is the first real answer to the question of how a letter could move so fast under such difficult conditions. It was not luck, and it was not one single clever invention solving the whole problem at a stroke. It was an institution that treated a soldier's Christmas parcel with the same operational seriousness the army gave to ammunition supply. Because, for the men receiving them, in a very real and immediate sense, morale genuinely was a supply line too, and everyone running the system understood that. Some of the men who kept that supply line moving are individually documented. Major Henry Kelly, who had worked at a post office sorting office in Manchester before the war, went on to be awarded the Victoria Cross for conduct under fire and returned to general post office work afterwards. Sergeant John Hogan, a postman from Oldham, served with the Manchester Regiment through the same period. Neither man's private letters survive for us to read here, and none should be invented. What their service records do confirm is simple but telling. This was not an army that borrowed a few postal clerks for a specialist task. It was, quite literally, postmen and sorting office staff serving in uniform, still doing recognizably the same job, only now under fire. By 1918, the workforce that had begun the war as a few hundred reservists numbered around 4,000 men. Every one of them had, in effect, a single job: to make sure that nothing sat still for longer than it absolutely had to. A sack of mail delayed at a railhead was not an abstract inefficiency. It was 100 soldiers who had not heard from home that week, and 100 families who had not heard back from them either. If you had never heard of the Royal Engineers Postal Section before this video, that is precisely why this channel exists. Subscribing keeps these stories coming, the parts of Britain's postal history that were recorded and the parts that very nearly were not. It is worth pausing here on what a letter actually meant to the man receiving it, because the mechanism we have just described only matters once you understand exactly what it was protecting. For a soldier serving in a static trench system, frontline duty could mean weeks at a time, with no reliable way to confirm to the people waiting for him that he was even still alive. A letter from home, in that setting, was never simply news to pass the time. It was proof. Proof that the world he had left behind still existed, unchanged, waiting patiently for him to return to it. And a letter he sent home in reply carried exactly the same weight of proof, running in the opposite direction, back across the channel. That is why the system's continued growth was never treated by those in charge as a side project, a courtesy, or a morale-boosting extra that could be scaled back under pressure. Officers who occasionally complained that postal deliveries were interrupting operational priorities were, more than once, quietly overruled by commanders who understood something important. A unit that believed it had been forgotten by the people at home fought very differently, and generally far worse, than a unit that knew it had not been. This is also why the censorship layer we will come to shortly sat so uneasily alongside the delivery effort itself. The same officers who fought to keep mail moving quickly were, in many cases, the same men required to slow it down again at their own desk, reading it line by line before it could travel any further. The system was never simply built for speed. It was built to balance speed against control, and that balance was never entirely comfortable for anyone required to enforce it. So we now understand how the physical chain worked, port to railhead to trench, and why the effort sustaining it was taken so seriously by people who had every reason to prioritize almost anything else. What we have not yet asked is a more uncomfortable question, and it is the one this video is really built around. If this was In practice, the machinery of the General Post Office, operating deep inside an active war zone, dressed in army uniform and answering to army discipline. Who was actually in charge of it? The obvious assumption is that the army ran its own mail the way it ran its own ammunition dumps, its own field kitchens, and its own transport pools. That assumption turns out to be only partly true, and the exception is by far the more interesting fact. The Royal Engineers Postal Section was, formally and on paper, part of the British Army. Its officers held military rank. Its men wore Royal Engineers uniform, were subject to military discipline, and served under military command in every visible respect. But its staff, its working methods, its sorting procedures, its recruitment, and very often its effective chain of accountability traced straight back to the General Post Office in London, not to Army headquarters at all. This was not a minor administrative technicality, of interest only to historians of bureaucracy. When questions were raised in the House of Commons about the handling of forces mail, delays, losses, censorship complaints from constituents, they were answered in Parliament by the Postmaster General, the civilian head of the Post Office, and not by the Secretary of State for War. In practical terms, the army supplied the uniforms, the rank structure, the discipline, and the physical protection of operating a unit near the front line. The Post Office supplied everything that actually made the system work: the trained staff, the institutional expertise, the sorting knowledge built up over decades of domestic service, and ultimately the political accountability when something went wrong. That is the reversal sitting at the center of this story. This was never simply a wartime add-on bolted onto the existing military machine because someone in Whitehall thought soldiers deserved letters. It was a civilian institution, temporarily dressed as a military one, operating at a scale and a speed the army itself had no independent capacity to replicate on its own. The people who made sure a letter reached a flooded trench in 2 or 3 days were, in almost every meaningful sense that matters, still post office employees. They had simply been sent to work somewhere considerably more dangerous than a sorting office counter in Manchester or Oldham, doing recognizably the same job under entirely unrecognizable conditions. That reversal raises a second, harder question, and it is one this video should not skip past. A postal service run largely by a civilian institution, but operating under military law in an active theatre of war, was never realistically going to remain a neutral messenger passing letters through untouched. And it did not. Under the Defence of the Realm Act, passed within days of the war, beginning in 1914, letters leaving the front were subject to censorship as standard practice, not as an exceptional wartime measure applied only occasionally. Somewhere between a soldier's pen and his family's letterbox, an officer, very often a junior one, with no specific training for the task and, by several accounts, no real enthusiasm for it either, was required to read the letter closely and remove anything that might reveal a location, a unit's strength, troop movements, or any other operational detail that could be useful to the enemy if intercepted. In practice, this meant lines crossed through with heavy ink, place names blacked out entirely, and sometimes whole paragraphs excised from a page, leaving behind a letter that still carried a familiar, recognizable handwriting, but no longer said everything it had originally been written to say. Some officers approached this duty with real seriousness, reading every line methodically. Others, by several documented accounts, could not bring themselves to read their own men's most personal and private lines at all, and quietly let letters through largely unaltered, rather than intrude any further than necessary on what a frightened soldier had chosen to tell his family. So the very same system built to connect a soldier to home was also, by design and by law, built to control precisely what that connection was allowed to say. Speed and surveillance travelled through the same envelope, carried by the same tired postal clerk, on the same crowded train. The post office was not simply delivering the war home to worried families. It was, quietly and continuously, editing it on the way, one crossed out line at a time. We now know the system was remarkably fast for its era, that it was run largely by postal professionals rather than career soldiers, and that it filtered, shaped, and occasionally silenced what it carried between the trench and the letterbox. What remains is the plainest and perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, put as simply as possible. Whose war, in the end, was this system actually built to serve? The answer is now direct, evidence-backed, and it is precisely the one this video set out to prove from its opening seconds. This was not, at its core, an army achievement that happened to wear a postal uniform for the sake of convenience. It was fundamentally a post office achievement, wearing a military uniform out of wartime necessity, nothing more. A reserve unit, built almost entirely from existing General Post Office staff, was absorbed into the British Army within days of mobilisation, in August 1914, and it never really stopped being what it had always been underneath the uniform. It took an already functioning civilian sorting and delivery network, the very same institution that handled a family's coal bill, a birthday card, or a savings bank deposit back in Oldham or Manchester, and extended that network into an active war zone, port by port and railhead by railhead, at a pace and a scale the military chain of command could never have matched, working entirely on its own. That, concretely, is how a letter posted in London could reach a flooded trench near Ypres in 2 or 3 days at the height of static trench warfare. Not because the army somehow engineered a postal miracle from first principles, but because the ordinary British post office simply kept doing the job it already knew how to do exceptionally well, at a scale nobody had ever asked of it before, under the single most dangerous and demanding conditions it had ever faced in its long history. It is worth stating plainly what this means for how we should picture the war itself. Behind every soldier writing a letter home was not a military bureaucracy improvising as it went, but one of Britain's most experienced civilian institutions, quietly operating at the peak of its own considerable competence, in a place nobody had designed it for, and under pressures nobody had planned for it to face. There is something quietly uncomfortable sitting inside that achievement, and this video is going to end on it rather than smoothing it over with a neat, reassuring conclusion. The same system that gave a frightened young man in a trench his only reliable proof that home still existed, unchanged and waiting, was also the very same system reading his private words before they ever arrived there, deciding on his behalf what he was permitted to say about where he was and what he had personally seen and endured. Connection and control moved through the same envelope, carried by the same overworked postal clerk, delivered by the same overloaded chain of lorries, trains and channel steamers. That censored envelope, marked in pencil somewhere behind the lines by an officer who may not have wanted the job at all, is not a footnote sitting at the edge of this story. It is, in a real sense, the story itself. It shows a post office fully capable of extraordinary, sustained care for entirely ordinary people, doing something few institutions of that era managed at that scale, and in the very same breath, entirely willing to open, read, and quietly reshape exactly what those ordinary people were permitted to feel connected to back home. The Royal Engineers Postal Section did not simply vanish when the war ended in 1918. Its staff went back, largely, to the ordinary counters and sorting frames they had come from, in Manchester, in Oldham, in towns and cities across Britain, carrying with them an experience that most of their neighbours never fully understood. Within a generation, facing the same problem on a far larger scale, the post office reached a very different conclusion. It stopped moving the letters at all. Instead, it photographed them, shrank them onto reels of microfilm, and sent the film. What that decision did to the weight of a mailbag, and to the privacy of everyone who wrote one, is the next part of this story.